Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Mary Elizabeth Williams, and this is Dame Prue Leith. She has had in her extraordinary career been a restaurateur, a caterer, a cooking school founder, a philanthropist, and entrepreneur, author of numerous cookbooks and novels. But for many of us, she is most indelibly a judge on our favorite show, the Great British Bake Off. She has two new books out right now, Bliss on Toast, 75 Simple Recipes, and the newly revised, eminently quotable memoir, I'll Try Anything Once. Hi, Prue, welcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, that's lovely.
All right, I want to get into the title of this book because the contents absolutely live up to the name, but this was not what this book was originally called. Why does this phrase mean something to you, and why did you want to change the title to reflect that?
Well, it had never been published. My autobiography, which was originally called Relish, was never published in the States. And I didn't have much profile in the States, and the few copies that got here didn't sell particularly well. Nobody had ever heard of me. And then when Bake Off became so popular, I suddenly became better known in the States than I am even in the UK. So it seemed a good idea to republish the book. And when I said, well, it's called Relish, the American company said, relish in America is something you put on a burger. So I don't think you want to call it that. So we felt we better change the name. Because in England, of course, relish means, well, of course it does in American too, but it meant a zest for life or a relish of everything, because I am a big enthusiast about a lot of things. So anyhow, we just banged around, thought, what do we call it? And I think I said, I'll try anything once, because I tend to do things because I think they sound like a good idea, and then I get very enthusiastic, and then I just do it. So, and I keep doing things that I've never done before. At the moment, I'm doing a one-woman show, which for an octogenarian to decide to get on a stage and tour all over America and all over Britain, talking about, telling stories. I hope, well, they are funny stories, and about my life. It's pretty well what's in that book, but it is a theatre show, and it's going incredibly well, and I can't believe it. And I started that at 82, so I sort of, in a way, I'm on a mission to say to older women, don't think it's all over just because you're 60, 70, 80, or I hope 90. You can
I
still
love
do good things.
I love that, Prue. I love that at every phase of your career, you have been finding new mountains to climb, new challenges, new love, all of those things. And when I read this book, I think a lot of us maybe know you, especially here in the States, know you for colorful necklaces. We know you for baking innuendo. What we didn't know, you are the master of that. But what I didn't know going into this book was that it was also going to touch on apartheid, abortion, death, aging, so many really intense things that you have been through, that you have confronted and overcome and dealt with. And one of the things that you are passionate about that I think resonates with a lot of us is this idea of assisted death and the right to a good death. This is such an intensely personal topic to you. Tell me a little bit about the work that you are doing in that space, why that was such an important thing to talk about in the book. And I'm also curious what a good death would look like for you. You must think about that.
Well, exactly. I think as you get older, you tend to think more about death, but we don't think about it enough. And I really think that people ought to consider what kind of a death they want. And too many people, A, don't consider it, or they believe this kind of myth that you get from the movies, which is you're lying in bed surrounded by your family, and you peacefully go out, and it's all very gentle. Well, of course, we'd all love to die in our sleep, gently in our own beds or whatever. But that's not what happens to most of us. Most of us end up dying usually in a hospital with a whole lot of well-meaning medics desperately trying to keep us alive, even if we don't want to be kept alive. And with no quality of life and no enjoyment. And a lot of us die without any friends or relatives around. And, it just seems awful to end one's life so badly when it's unnecessary. And so I campaign for an organization called Dignity in Dying. But there are a lot of other organizations that are campaigning for much the same thing. And I don't know that what is the absolute right, best law to have. What I do know is that in Britain, we need to change the law. We need to make it possible to die when you want to die. If you're terminally ill and you've been diagnosed that you will die within 6 months, of course, you can never be totally accurate about this, but if it's certain that you have a terminal disease and you do not want to live it out in agony and pain and whatever, you should be allowed to either be legally given the means, the medicine, the drug that will kill you, or you need a doctor to help you do it, physically help you do it, which is what they have in Canada. There are arguments for both sides. There are risks on both things. There's nothing is without risk. But I think we have to legislate for the majority. And we may not be able to legislate for everybody, because where do you draw the line? You wouldn't want children opting to die. You wouldn't want young men. The biggest danger of suicide in young men is between 19 and 25 or something. Well, we know that passes. That's a stage in, when young people are at their most vulnerable. But we know that generally, if you get to 25, you'll stay alive. You've got a likelihood of living as long as anybody else. So we wouldn't want to, we want to not allow a 19-year-old who's just lost his girlfriend and hasn't got a job and is desperate to get out. We wouldn't want him to do it. Perhaps we shouldn't we shouldn't have people with mental difficulties. There's a lot of, and yet in Canada, they have started a lot of people, groups like disabled groups or mentally handicapped people who represent mentally handicapped people are arguing that it's discriminatory to allow some people to die and not to allow others. So what I'm saying is the whole thing is extremely complicated and difficult, but that is not a reason to do nothing. We need
and definitely not a reason to not talk about it and have these kinds of conversations that you are having and using your platform to discuss and bring to our attention. There's so many other things that you talk about in this book too, like I said, about your relationships, about infidelity, about adoption. What to you was the hardest thing to write about in this book? Because you touch on so many.
The hardest thing to write about was probably my love affair with my first husband, which was a secret for 13 years, because his wife was a great friend of mine, and both the families were extremely close. She was my mother's best friend, and she had married my husband when she was 40 and he was 20. So there was a 20-year gap between them. And then when he was about 40, he fell in love with me, and I was only 20. So there was a 20-year gap between us. Rain was sort of between us. He had a first wife who was 20 years older than him and a lover who was 20 years younger than him. And it was really difficult for both of us, because we both, he didn't want to hurt Nan. I didn't want him to leave her, because I was quite happy. I was building my business. I liked being alone. I didn't want marriage. I wasn't desperate for children. So I was fine for 10 years. And then I hit the famous 30s, when you start to want a baby badly. And so at that point, it became really difficult. And I wanted to leave him, and I tried hard to leave him. I ran away from him at one point. But I loved him so much, I kept coming back. And in the end, I did get pregnant. And then we had to just come into the open, and I wanted a baby very badly. And so we then told everybody, and it was really difficult for a while, but his wife was a wonderful woman. She insisted we all stayed friends, and so did he. And the families did stay friends. It wasn't easy, and I think a couple of them still don't really. I don't have the same relationship with them as I had before, but I think everybody behaved as well as they could, and I don't think that as a result of all that, people often say to me, "Well, would you have done it differently?" And the answer is no. I mean, he was the love of my life. He was the most important thing, still is the most important influence on my life. He was the chairman of my company. He helped me with everything, father of my children. We adopted a Cambodian daughter together. I mean, I wouldn't have missed any of that so yes, I think adultery is wrong. Yes, I think it was wicked. And no, I would still have done it.
I love that. And I love, Prue, that in this book you take on all of these things that are complicated, that are not black and white, that there are no easy answers for. And you again and again show in this book, as you've said, that at every stage of life there are new challenges, there are new things that you can accomplish and achieve. And I love there's a line in it where you say that the hardest thing right now is having enough time for all of the things that you still want to do. You certainly could not have expected, I think, in your 70s, becoming a judge on GBBO, having the kind of international success you have now. You said in the book that you didn't think that they would hire you because you said, I think the quote is, you didn't think that they would hire another old lady, and you hadn't really even watched very much of the show. What made you decide to take that risk then and go ahead and go for it?
Oh, well, I mean, who would resist it? I mean, of course I said yes. I think I was just amazed by good luck. But I think the long and the short of it, what had happened was the formula had really worked with Mary Berry. It was tremendously successful. She was an absolute icon, national treasure. We all love her. And so I thought, well, Channel 4 is a sort of trendy, very advanced, very woke broadcasting channel, and they'll want to have some young dude, some probably, I don't know. I could think of quite a few people who would have been exactly fitted that role, but they obviously thought, no, it works with Mary. What we need is another old lady. And actually, to be honest, I think Paul Hollywood had a lot to do with that, because I had to have an audition, and I know that they auditioned a lot of younger people and other people, men and women, to be Paul's partner. And Paul, when we were having the audition, Paul really helped me, because we had to judge. We were having an audition that we had to judge soda bread and brownies, nice simple things. And we walked onto the set and to judge the first thing, which I think was the soda bread. And Paul, you know how confident and knowledgeable and articulate he is. He never ums, he never errs. He just goes bang in, says exactly what's right and wrong about the bake in front of him, very succinctly and perfect. And he went and did that. And he was dead right. I mean, there was nothing he said that I could not agree with. And there was nothing I could add. It was just perfect. So I just said, I agree. Paul is right. So then when we stopped filming, Paul said, you can't just do that. You can't just agree with me. It's a television show. You've got to get in there. So then we judged the brownies, and I sort of more or less pushed him aside and told the world what I thought of the brownies. And then I got the job.
And that's
so Paul helped me get the job, is the long and short of it. And I think they must have probably asked him to, which of the people you've seen do you want? And he must have said me. But I think I owe it to Paul.
You had an advocate in your corner. You talk about the formula for the show, and yet the show has evolved. It has changed. It has changed in the makeup of the cast of characters in it. And over the past few years, particularly this past season, people have seen an evolution in the types of things the types of foods that are being made. And there is a question of, so what is a bake anymore? What does a bake on the Great British Bake Off mean now? I want to ask you, what that word bake means to you in the context of the show and in your work.
I do. I see the difficulty. I mean, if by bake you mean the classical answer is, well, bake goes in the oven. Bake is something that has been put in the oven. But I think that would stop us doing an awful lot of things. I mean, you wouldn't have, I don't know. I mean, a lot of things like trifle, for example, there's some baking in it, but most of it is not baking. And so I think that broadly what we mean for a bake is either a dessert or cake or something that's been in the oven, and it can be savory, but it must be close to baking. I mean, the only times we break the rule about going in the oven is if we make a flatbread, which is made on a griddle, or on a flat frying pan or something, or crepe. But a pancake and a flatbread is quite close to baking. I think we can cheat a bit, and I think that the broadening the challenges is quite necessary, because people's tastes have changed. I mean, at the moment, I've been traveling around America and Canada, and everywhere I've gone, you can see how the influences of Mexico are there. There are tortillas or flatbreads or tacos everywhere. And they are taking the place of sandwiches. Well, now a sandwich you'd accept had enough baking element into it. But why would we have a sandwich and not have a taco? So I think people must just have a bit of, don't be pedantic about it. If it makes a good competition, that's fine.
And it's a process of learning, right? I think a lot of us here in the States watched Mexico Week and said, okay, seems like maybe the UK still has a few things to learn about Mexican food. Do you think that was fair?
I agree, and I think we do have a few things to learn. And we were all really upset about that, because Paul, for example, had just come back from a month in Mexico where he had made a wonderful program called Paul Eats Mexico, and he'd been around eating all sorts of, I mean, obviously some tacos and some refried beans and all the things that people complained that we used. But he had also been eating all much more sophisticated Mexican food, and he absolutely loves Mexican food and loves Mexico. And he'd been very influential in saying, choosing the challenges. But I think we hadn't. What was so upsetting about it was the idea that we would somehow want to be either patronizing or mocking, or the truth is that on Bake Off, we make jokes about everything. But we certainly would never do it meaning to be anything other than friendly. And I mean, people got upset because the hosts wore sombreros and ponchos or something. But you can't arrive in Mexico and walk through the airport without people wanting to sell you ponchos and sombreros. Yes, they're cliches, but then a hot dog is a cliche, and Americans don't mind if we make a hot dog. So it's really difficult, because there will always be people who just are upset by it, and I'm sorry we upset anybody. And I mean, you just think of Bake Off. It means the essence of Bake Off is that it's friendly. It never tries to humiliate people. It's very inclusive. You only have to look at our bakers and you can see that we try very hard to make sure that we represent the bakers of Britain or the bakers of America. There'll be every color, every age, every ethnic origins that exist in the country. So the thought that we should not take seriously somebody's cuisine is really upsetting. But obviously we made some mistakes, and but I really hate, what I really would hate to see, I'd hate to see people becoming so protective of their own cuisine that they don't like any kind of adaptation or any kind of imitation. First of all, imitation is a sign of flattery. You only want to copy somebody's cuisine or steal ideas from it because you like it. And if we are going to be very correct and say, you must never do anything that could be smacks of cultural appropriation, does that mean we can't do Italian food, German food? The whole of American food is, all of American cuisine has come from somewhere else, mostly Europe. If people are going to be indignant about ever taking any ideas from any other country, that's the end of cuisine. All people, Britain is exactly the same. Britain's cuisine is a mass of influences from outside.
That's
the end of my speech.
Curry. Yeah. you gave us a lot of, it's by way of that we discover all of these different cuisines, right? Absolutely. I want to ask you about the show a little more, because one of the things that you have said is about the way that this show is so positive and hopeful. You know, people talk about comfort TV in a way that I think feels kind of dismissive. And yet the love that people have for GBBO, the absolute affection and protectiveness that people feel about it comes from something emotional. What do you think that connection is, Prue, that people feel so deeply about this show?
Do you know, I think part of the success of Break Off is because we live in such stressful times that people need an hour off from life. You know, if you're working and you've got children at school and you're worried about their progress and you've got to get them to school and get them and then get to work and then travel on the L line or the tube or get in a traffic jam, or I mean, daily life was stressful before COVID. Now we've added COVID to it. A war in Ukraine, the economy is collapsing, politics all over the world in a mess. We need things like Bake Off as a kind of medicine almost, or sort of recovery time. It's like a good sleep or a massage. It makes you feel better.
A big glass of wine.
A big glass of wine, exactly. And both of them together is the best. Bake Off and a big glass of wine. So, yeah, no, I don't want to make it sound as if it's just therapy. But interestingly, when there was a danger that we wouldn't have Bake Off in the UK, the government was really concerned that Bake Off should continue because they knew that they couldn't deprive people stuck at home with their children of something where the family could actually sit at peace together on a sofa for at least an hour a week. You know, they realized this was really important. So they moved heaven and earth to make, well, of course, we had amazing restrictions. I know that the first Bake Off we filmed in COVID, we filmed, actually two of them we filmed in a hotel in Essex, in the middle of the countryside, in the middle of nowhere, which was completely sealed off by security guards. We couldn't go out, nobody could come in. And we had a 150-acre cordon sanitaire around us. And it must have lost the company an absolute fortune to put it on, because they had to house 150 of us in a posh hotel. They had to import everything, in advance. It was an amazing logistic problem, and I think it must have lost an absolute fortune. But it was necessary. It would have been dreadful not to. I'm not exaggerating when I say I think it would have been really bad for the nation if we'd not had Bake Off to watch, and a few other things.
And not just your nation, right? Right, and also here for us in the U.S. I want to ask you, Prue, about Bliss on Toast, because I love that you downplay your own culinary expertise. You say, "Oh, I'm not really much of a baker. I'm not really much of a cook." And
I know I'm a good cook. I don't
okay.
never say I'm not much of a cook.
What was the phrase you said, that you're
Very
not
good.
a super technical cook, that you are humble about your cooking though in this book.
Yeah. I mean, I like simple food.
You're a humble cook. But in your memoir, you talk about toast. You talk about the baguettes in Paris, living on those. What was it about this book? You say how it started with an Instagram post that made you want to, of all the things you could have chosen for your next book.
No, I think what really did it for me was I was during the lockdown, during the pandemic, I was at home with my husband on my own. My children were in London and my grandchildren were with them. So it was just the two of us. And I would be and I'm a caterer and a restaurateur. I can't cook for two, really. I like to cook for 4 or 20 better. And so I would make, let's say, a chicken casserole, and then we'd eat the rest for leftovers. And there'd still be some leftovers. And then I think, what am I going to do with this? And I'd put it on toast. And then I started thinking that looks rather boring, brown stuff on brown stuff, And so I would add, I don't know, pickled fennel or grilled tomatoes or something just to liven it up a bit. And John kept saying, my husband, that this is delicious and it looks so good and it's a proper meal, even though it's just stuff on toast. And so after a while, I started keeping notes of what I was doing, and then posting things on Instagram and finding people loved them. And then I started doing it I was writing for the Oldie, it's a magazine for oldies. And so I would do something on toast, take a photograph of it, and publish it just with a caption that said, let's say, toasted rye, smoked salmon, cream cheese, capers, or whatever was there on it. And there was no recipe. There was just this picture and the caption. And I figured that people could make it from looking at the picture. I'm thinking, well, I can do that, just assemble these things. So I did this very successfully for the oldie, and the readers absolutely loved it. And so I went to my publisher and I said, what about, let's do a book? And they said, yes, but we can't just do it. And I said, it can cost $5. It can be the size of a piece of toast, just a tiny little bit, size of, just with a picture and the caption, like that. And they said, no, people who buy a book want recipes. And there are people who really cannot look at a picture and think, they want to know how much smoked salmon and how much cream cheese and how much capers and what kind of capers and what do you do if you haven't got smoked salmon? Is there an alternative? So in the end, it turned out to be a proper book.
I have to ask you one more question, even though I know the answer. But Prue, it was honestly probably my favorite insight in the whole book, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you say? What do you tell people? Because they ask you a lot. Is it really hard eating cake all day, Prue?
Of course it's not. The cake is delicious. You only have to have a teaspoon of each one. I mean, occasionally, if the bakes are really, really complicated, so that every cake, say there's a 3-layer cake and they all have to be different and they've all got to have different icing. I mean, Paul and I are always asking them, can you just make sure it's only one kind of cake? Because otherwise we have to have so many mouthfuls. But I reckon if you can get the icing, the filling and the cake in 1 teaspoon, and there are 12 bakers on there, and you have a signature thing and a showstopper, and the showstopper is not too, you can probably get away with 1,200, 1,500 calories. So if you don't eat breakfast and you don't eat lunch, you've still got 500 calories for a couple of glasses of wine and no liquid supper.
That sounds like my perfect day. That sounds like my absolute.
A lot of cake followed by a couple of glasses of wine. I agree with you. Not
Prue,
good for you,
I'm with
very
you.
nice.
Prue Leith, thank you so much for joining us. What an absolute pleasure to talk to you. What a wonderful 2 books you have written now. And I can't wait to see what GBBO brings us next. Thank you so much for your time, Prue.
Thank you. Thank you very much.